Hello, everyone. We are going to be starting a new book, and our story is called Who Was Thomas Alva Edison? So, our story is actually kind of like a biography. It is written by Margaret Frith and illustrated by John O'Brien. Okay, now the back of our story says, Who was Thomas Alva Edison? A curious child who fed worms to a friend to see if she would fly like a bird, a boy who left school at the age of 12 and was hard of hearing all his life, the man who changed the world when he invented the electric light bulb, or all of the above. Which one do you think? This tells us all of the above. We're going to read about Thomas Alva Edison in this fun and exciting book. Now, Thomas Alva Edison was an inventor, and he made some pretty awesome things. We are going to be reading this story, and it is going to tie in with social studies and with science, okay? So, we need to make sure that we are doing all of the activities for all of the subjects so that we know what's going on, okay? Now, let's take a look really quick. With this story, let me get rid of my little notes. Our table of contents lets us know that there are 7 main parts. Well, 8-ish. The first is Who was Thomas Alva Edison? And the second is Always Curious. Those are the first 2 that we're going to read today. We'll read Young Inventor tomorrow. Okay? So let's take a look at these first 2 sections. So starting up, who was Thomas Alva Edison? One day, the Edisons couldn't find 6-year-old Al, as his family called him. They were visiting Al's older sister and her husband on their farm. It was just outside of Mellon, Ohio. The year was 1853. Suddenly, Al's uncle had an idea. He ran out to the barn, and there he found Al, sitting on a pile of straw. He was trying to hatch a goose egg. He had seen a hen sitting on her eggs when some baby chicks came out. Al wanted to make a baby goose come out of the egg. The Edisons weren't surprised. They had 3 other children, but their youngest, Al, was the most curious. He would be that way all of his life. The world was very different when Thomas Alva Edison was a child. No electric light to see by, no recorded music to listen to, no movies to watch. It was Edison who made all these possible and much more, changing our lives forever. Edison firmly believed in inventions, ones that could make everyday lives easier and more comfortable. That is exactly what he accomplished. Thomas Alva Edison was perhaps the greatest inventor of his time. That was our first little section. Now, read along with me with Chapter 1, Always Curious. Thomas Alva Edison was born on February 11, 1847, on a cold, snowy night in Mellon, Ohio. His parents, Nancy and Samuel, named him Thomas after his great-uncle, and Alva after Captain Alva Bradley, a good friend of his father. The family didn't call him Tom or Tommy. They called him Al. Little Al wanted to find out everything about the world around him. He went about it like a scientist, doing an experiment. He didn't just ask questions. He liked to find out the answers himself. Once Al broke open a bumblebee's nest to see what was inside. Another time he watched birds eat worms and fly off, so Al made a mixture out of water and mashed worms. Then he gave it to a neighbor girl to drink. That doesn't really sound good to me. He wanted to see if eating worms would make her fly, but it just made her sick, and Al got a licking with a birch branch. Nothing stopped Al, not bees, not a licking, not even falling into a grain storage bin. He was walking around the rim of the bin when he fell in. Luckily, someone pulled him out by the legs just before he was buried under the wheat. Al's father owned a small grain and timber mill in Millen. Boats like Captain Alva Bradley's carried timber down from Canada across Lake Erie, down the Huron River, and through the Millen Canal. There it was cut into logs and planks at mills like Mr. Edison's. Trucks and cars had not yet been invented, and trains didn't come to Millen. But one day, a railroad line was built. Trains started chugging into town, and the canal wasn't so important anymore. The railroads were faster and easier to use for carrying things around the country, so when Al was 7, the family moved to a new home in Port Huron, in Michigan, more than 100 miles north of Millen. They lived in a big house on the St. Clair River. Al's father did lots of things to earn a living. He worked as a carpenter. He ran a grocery store. He had a vegetable garden. He tried farming. He even built a 100-foot tower overlooking the river. For 25 cents, anyone could climb up and watch the boats go by. The Edisons had only been there a short time when Al got scarlet fever. It was a serious illness back then, without the medicines used today. Let's look at some pictures. So that's where they moved to. And that's the tower that his father built. Would you guys pay 25 cents to climb up it? 25 cents doesn't seem like much, but a long time ago, it was a little bit more. He ran a high fever. A red rash broke over his skin. This was back when Tom got sick. Al got better, but he realized that he couldn't hear as well as he used to, probably because of the scarlet fever. In school, the teacher complained that Al didn't pay attention. He would drift off. Maybe he was bored, or maybe he just couldn't hear anything. One day, 8-year-old Al heard his teacher telling someone that he was addled. He meant Al's brain was scrambled. Is that a good thing to say? No, that's not a good thing to say. When Al told his mother, she was furious. She took him out of school and began teaching him at home. Is there anybody else that we know that gets taught at home? I think you guys do, don't you? That's pretty cool. So you guys actually have something in common with Thomas Alva Edison, don't you? Al loved to read. How surprised his teacher would have been to see the difficult books his mother gave to him. Books about history, nature, and science. He read them just as fast as he could. One book was a favorite. It was called A School Compendium of Natural and Experimental Philosophy. Wow. It was a science book. It talked about electricity, batteries, electrical toys, and a lot more. It had simple experiments. Al got so excited he started doing experiments all over the house. He used stuff like feathers, beeswax, chemicals from the drugstore. His bedroom was full of jars and bottles. Finally, his mother sent him to the basement to set up his own lab. That's pretty cool. The next section is a section on Samuel Morse. We're going to have an activity to do with this too in language arts. Morse, does that ring a bell to anybody? Does anybody recognize that name? Samuel Morse was born in Charleston, Massachusetts. He was a portrait painter for the first half of his life. Morse was always interested in science, especially electricity. He was 41 years old when he had an idea. What about sending messages in code through a wire? The idea came to him while he was on a ship, traveling home from France, where it had taken a whole month for a letter to reach him from America. The simple instrument he built in 1837 worked the very first time, but it wasn't until 1844 that he could send the first official telegram. Morse tapped out words from the Bible. What hath God wrought? It went from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland, 34 miles away. It took less than a second to travel through the wire. This is Edison, written in Morse code. Again, we're going to look at that as an activity in language arts. One part of the book interested Al most of all. It was about Morse's telegraphic alphabet. Morse was the name of a code. It was used to send messages over telegraph wires. There were no telephones yet. You couldn't talk to someone far away, but you could send a message that reached them quickly. Samuel Morse made up the code. Instead of using letters and numbers, he used dots and dashes to send messages and became known as telegrams. The railroad played a big part because the telegraph wires that carried telegrams were strung on poles along the railroad tracks. An operator in a railroad station could wire ahead if schedules changed or if there was an accident or a delay of some kind. Telegraphy made the trains safer. An operator tapped out a message of dots and dashes with a metal key on a board. The message raced across the wire as electrical pulses to the next station. The dots and dashes were notched or cut into a roll of paper. An operator decoded the message using Morse code and wrote down the message in words. Telegrams were expensive, so mostly businesses sent them. But people sent them too for news they wanted to get to their families and friends fast, like the birth of a new baby. Al couldn't wait to try this. He made a simple telegraph key, and he began learning Morse code. He even set up a wire between his house and a friend's. As they learned the code, they began sending messages back and forth. Soon Al would go to work on the railroad. It was there that his interest in telegraphy grew much more serious. That would be really fun, wouldn't it? Being able to send messages to a friend that lives close by. I think it'd be pretty cool. Make sure to check the lesson plans for some very interesting activities. And tomorrow, we will read about a young inventor. Bye, everyone.